Chapter 16 Tucka's Tale Read by Mr. Wentz As the three squirrels hurried along, Tucka told Jed and Setsa her tale. "I was just a pup," she said. "When my mother and my brother were flattened, I would have been flattened too, except that I had stopped to eat a tulip. I was still too small to reach most tulips, but this one was tiny and low to the ground. My mother kept saying, 'Hurry!' but I couldn't help myself. I popped it into my mouth. It was so tasty. But even as I was savoring it, something huge flashed by, and Mama and Buddy..." A tear escaped from the corner of her eye. For a moment it was a perfect crystal sphere on her cheek fur. Then she brushed it away. "Well, I have not been able to eat a tulip since," she said. "I don't mean to be stupid," said Setsa quietly. "But what is a tulip?" "A kind of flower," said Tucka. "Really tasty. At least that's how I remember it." "What was it that flashed by?" asked Jed. Tucka looked at them, amused. "You haven't lived among humans, have you?" she said. "No," said Jed. "We see them sometimes," said Setsa, "but they don't stay, they just pass through." "Well, I grew up among them," said Tucka. "Our grove was in one of their colonies. It was all right most of the time. They don't actually come out of their nests all that often. When they do, they travel inside these big... I don't even know how to explain them to you. Imagine a beetle that is as big as, just really big. So big the humans crawl inside of them, and then, when they have traveled somewhere, they crawl back out, undigested. And you better stay out of that beetle's way." "Because it steps on you?" asked Jed. Tucka considered. She didn't know how to explain wheels. She didn't understand them herself. "It would be like getting in the way of a huge boulder rolling down a hill. You would be smashed, flattened. It happens fairly often because they move so fast you can't get out of their way. They come out of nowhere and bam!" "Crikey," said Jed. "It sounds scary," said Setsa. "So what did you do?" asked Jed. "Who took care of you?" "I moved into my grandfather's nest," said Tucka. "Where was your father?" asked Setsa gently. "Raccoon," said Tucka matter-of-factly. "At least that's what I was told. I never knew him. But my grandfather was very kind and very wise. He taught me so much. He told me stories. He knew more than any squirrel I've ever met. Of course, he was also very old." "Are squirrels wise because they're old?" mused Jed. "Or old because they're wise?" "That's something you could wonder about all day," laughed Setsa. "Probably it works both ways." "But even if a squirrel is very, very wise," said Tucka, "he can only get so old. As the poem goes, squirrels are fleet and life is fleeting. Gather ye nuts and feast while ye may. This sounds better in squirrel. It rhymes and it has a lot of clicks. "So my grandfather had this idea," she went on. "All his life he had wanted to see how far he could travel without touching the ground. It was because of the ancient stories that tell of how a squirrel could once travel from one edge of the world to the other this way. 'I think it can still be done,' he said to me. 'We might have to backtrack, look for new paths, but I would like to see the edge of the world for myself. I would like to get there without touching the ground.' Would you like to go with your old grandfather?" he asked. He was probably growing foolish in his age, and I was still foolish in my youth. Of course I went. At first it was exciting. It is always a lark to look for a new path, to find one where none seems possible. But as we traveled, I began to notice that grandfather was faltering. There were jumps that should have been easy, but now he was barely grasping the landing. He chuckled and acted as if it was nothing, but we both knew what was happening. I tried to watch out for him. "I'm tired," I would say. "Let's take the easy path," or "Let's stop for today." But there was a part of him that could not give up. He really wanted to make it to the edge. I was a little afraid of it myself. I mean, what if we fell off? What then? "I cannot even imagine it," said Setsa. "My brain is not that big. Are you sure there even is an edge?" "It's an old-fashioned idea," said Jed. Some squirrels think the forest is endless. Some think it circles back and meets itself. But no one really knows. At least no squirrel has returned to tell us. Well, Tucka went on, my grandfather wanted to find out, and one day he thought we had found it, the edge, and it really did look as if we had. He crept out to the end of the last branch. He waved goodbye, then he stepped off into the fog. I waited there for a long time, she said, overnight and into the next day. The fog lifted and I could see far below a river. There was more world on the other side of it. This wasn't the edge, but my grandfather, one way or another, was gone. By this time we had journeyed far from our home. We had taken many winding paths. I backed away from the edge and turned around, but I did not know how to find my way home. Eventually I settled, so that is why I am solitary. But, she said, the story you told of the shredding and scattering, it's a story my grandfather told. He had seen it too. That's why I listened. To the other squirrel and to you. That's why I came along. A good story makes a journey go by more quickly. A really good story makes you forget you're even on a journey. You don't notice the cold, wet winds that spatter your fur with silver droplets. You don't realize when you step from one branch to another, or even that your feet are moving. You stop noticing with all of your senses the things you really ought to notice. What sort of things? If you are a squirrel, there are so many kinds to watch out for. The kind that rumbles in the distance. The kind that follows stealthily downwind and licks its chop when you pause. The kind that is a dead branch that has been holding to its trees by a few fibrous strands, then fewer strands, then one strand, and then that one strand breaks and the branch falls through the air below you, and watch out! The kind where vapor freezes in the clouds into small, roundish masses of ice that fall, and suddenly, instead of drops of rain or even snow, icy balls the size of walnuts are pelting your pelt. That's the kind that happened now. The hungry fox, who had been following the squirrels from below, flinched as his pelt was pelted with ice balls. He forgot his focus on food and scrambled for shelter in a lean-to formed by fallen firs. The squirrels, too, ducked and raced for cover from the hailstones. Jed and Tucka flattened themselves against what they hoped was the safer side of a tree trunk. Then they heard Setsa shout, "Here! Up here!" They looked up and saw her head poking out from a hollow in the tree. Quickly they climbed up and crawled in beside her. Together they watched the wintry mix of drops and flakes and hailstones fly willy-nilly down from the heavens. It was a good time to stay put. It was a lousy time to try to convince anyone to move. They didn't even want to move their own selves out of the small shelter they had found. The view outside the knothole was the opposite of a fireplace, but just as hypnotic. Huddled together for warmth, they watched the storm rage transfixed. The light of day, already dimmed by the thick, heavy clouds, faded further to black. The wild song of the wind, muffled by the curved walls around them, lullabied the three squirrels into sleep.